When I first watched the 2020 movie Emma, I instantly fell in love with the pink Spencer jacket that Emma wears at the very beginning. I remember thinking one day I'd love to make a jacket like that. Fast forward a few years, my friend Laurence and I had just bought our tickets to the Jane Austen Festival, and that jacket immediately came back to mind. Around the same time, I visited the Chertsey Museum, which is about an hour outside of London. They had a Regency fashion exhibition going on, and there was the actual Spencer jacket that inspired Emma's costume. Dated around 1815 to 1817, it was even more exquisite in person than in the movie. After taking photo of every single detail from every single angle, I felt that the stars had aligned for me and it was finally time to make my own version of this Spencer jacket. This was my first time recreating a museum piece, so I had to be extra careful when making the pattern. I draped the jacket on top of a Regency dress I had just made for the festival. But since the dress form and I aren't quite the same shape, it didn't fit quite right. So I ended up having to put the mock-up on and off myself over and over again. It took 6 mock-ups and many small adjustments to get to the pattern that I was happy with. According to the museum description, the original jacket was made from silk taffeta with a cotton lining. So I chose the same materials for my recreation, cutting the lining in a plain white cotton and the outer layer in a pale pink silk taffeta. The silk was actually leftover fabric from the petticoat of a robe à la française I made about 5 years ago, so this felt like the perfect way to give it a new life. Because this jacket has so much decoration, I decided to add a layer of fusible interfacing to the silk taffeta to give it a bit more strength. I'm usually not a huge fan of fusible interfacing, but there was only 2 weeks left before the Jane Austen Festival. So between conscience and sleep, I chose to sleep. The first decoration I decided to tackle was the rouleau trim on the jacket body. Thankfully, I made a very wise decision to test it first on my muslin mock-up, because it took several tries to figure out how to transfer the pattern. My first idea was to poke tiny holes along the rouleau design and use powdered chalk to mark the design through the pinholes. I even made a tiny chalk puff by scraping some chalk with a knife and wrapping it in a scrap piece of muslin. Unfortunately, that brilliant plan didn't actually work. Then I tried marking through the pinholes with a pencil, but after about the 10th hole, I decided that was not a sustainable life choice either. Finally, I just cut out the pattern and traced around it with a heat-sensitive pen, and that finally worked. Next, I tested a few variations of the rouleau trim. The 3 samples here were made by folding the bias tape into 4, 6, and 8 layers. In the end, I went with the 6-layer version because it looked the closest to the original museum piece. To figure out how much bias tape I need, I used a piece of cotton yarn to measure one side of the back trim, which was about 1 meter long. So for all 6 sections across the back, shoulders, and front, I'd need around 8 meters of bias tape in total. I did think about using a sewing machine for this, but since the finished rouleau was only about 5 mm wide, that was basically impossible to achieve with a sewing machine. So I ended up doing all of it by hand. When I was trying to figure out how the original Spencer jacket was pieced together, I realized that it was really cleverly designed. The 6 sections of the rouleau trim line up perfectly with 4 seams and 2 darts, so the construction lines are all hidden away by the beautiful decorations. I started by sewing the back piece to the two side panels. After that, I traced the trim pattern directly on top and stitched the rouleau tubes along the design. About halfway through, I realized that I'd made a small mathematical error. When I measured the bias tape earlier, I only measured half of one section and forgot to double it. So instead of 8 meters, I actually needed about 15. Which meant I had to go back and hand stitch another 7 meters of bias tape. But all for the greater good, I guess. So last night I stayed up till 2 AM to finish these bits, which took about 10 hours. I also stitched the bust darts and traced out where the rouleau trim should go from here. So today's goal is to finish the trim in the front first, and then I can piece together the shoulder seam and finish the last 2 rows of the rouleau trim. Oh, these are like cartoon centipedes. Don't mind me guys, I'm going crazy. Altogether, the rouleau trim took me over 30 hours to finish. Despite the manual labor, the result is definitely quite satisfying to look at, and weirdly even more so from the back. So once I stitched together the side seam, the basic shape of the garment would finally start to come together. The jacket was cut on the bias at the center front, so I added a strip of twill tape to stabilize the edge before folding in the seam allowance. During my research, I came across a really helpful blog called The Hidden Wardrobe, written by Stephanie Smart. She shared a series of close-up photos of the original museum piece, and one of them shows a glimpse of the inside, where you can see a white tape sewn along the hem. So to replicate that detail, I also stitched on a 1-inch wide twill tape along the bottom edge. Next, I moved on to making the decorations on the collar and epaulettes. From the photos, it looks like the piping on the original piece was probably made from silk satin in a very similar shade. But at this point, I was only a week from the deadline. So instead of running all over London to find the perfect fabric, I decided to just go with the same silk taffeta and hope for the best. I started by sewing the piping onto the collar. From what I can tell, the double-layered collar was probably made from a single piece of fabric cut open in the middle. The piping needed to be stitched on really precisely, so I basted it onto the collar first before machine stitching it. Then I carefully cut a slit in the collar and slip-stitched the bias tape to the back. The museum description mentions that the original jacket has a buckram lining. I completely forgot about that, but I think the fusible interfacing kinda did the job. So I just ended up using the same approach for both the collar and the two epaulettes. Next up were the little leaf decorations. From my rough calculation, I needed about 60 pieces. Here's another photo reference from the hidden wardrobe. You can clearly see how the leaves were constructed. The piping was quite crudely cross-stitched to the back, which is a stark contrast to how delicate and neat the garment looks overall. I loved the practicality behind this detail. The seamstress clearly knew where to spend her time. Just focus on the areas people can see and spend as little as necessary on the hidden parts. Even though each leaf was constructed the same way as the collar and the epaulettes, piping such tiny pieces with all those corners were so much harder. Each leaf was only about 3 fingers wide, but the 60 pieces together required over 10 meters of piping. These leaves took another 20 to 30 hours to complete. For these few days, my routine after work was basically just eat, sleep, and make leaves. But in the end, this whole plate of tiny cute leaves was absolutely worth it. I attached the individual leaves onto the epaulettes, following the pattern of the original garment. The word epaulette itself hints at a strong military influence behind the Spencer jacket. Although it's now seen as a classic piece of Regency women's wear, its origin and development were heavily influenced by menswear of the time. After all, the Spencer became popular during the Napoleonic Wars, when many military details found their way into women's fashion. You can really see that influence here on this epaulette. Although its design is more delicate and decorative, the overall silhouette still closely resembles those on military uniforms. When it came to making the lining, I went back once again to this close-up photo, which shows exactly how the original lining was attached. Am I all done with the decorations, you may ask? And the answer is absolutely not. If you look further down the jacket, you will see some really beautiful details on the cuffs, which once again shows a strong resemblance to military wear at the time, particularly to the decorative braiding on the hussar uniform. The first part I tackled was the 2 rows of decorative trim on the cuffs, which I made using the leftover rouleau tubes. The real challenge, however, came with the frogging above. I started by recreating the tiny circular band that somehow fits 6 rows of piping. It may look small and simple, but it was anything but. Getting those 6 rows so closely together was surprisingly tricky, and it took me more than a few tries to get it right. And even then, the rows still didn't feel as tight as the original, So I decided to thread my needle vertically through all 6 layers to pull them in. And of course, that's exactly when my needle decided to snap. After taking a brief 3-second moment of silence for the sacrifice of this needle, I went back to finishing the band. I trimmed away the excess piping cord, rolled the strip into a circle, and voila, a very cute, very tiny fabric band. It measures barely a centimeter across, and yet this little thing took me 2 hours to make. The fabric loop on the inside was once again made from the leftover rouleau tubes, which by comparison was so much easier to make. So now I've got 1 complete frogging, and yeah, I just need to repeat the same process 9 more times. Totally doable. At long last, I could finally attach the sleeves to the main body. But before that, I needed to gather the epaulettes and stitch them onto the sleeves. Then I closed up the sleeve seams and attached them to the jacket. The final step was the collar, which was made in pretty much the same way as the epaulettes. I stitched the outer fabric to the jacket and then hand finished the seam on the lining. From one of the close-up photos I took at a museum, I noticed that the original collar was slightly off-centered, which was probably meant to make room for the button. However, I completely forgot about that detail while making mine, so I just finished it off with a pair of hook and eyes instead. And that marks the end of my attempt at recreating this 1810 Spencer jacket. In total, the whole project took around 130 hours, and I managed to finish it just 4 days before the Jane Austen Festival. Which means it's time for the big review. Knowing myself, I have no idea when the next video will be out. But if you enjoy watching me making both Western and Chinese historical clothing, please subscribe to my channel and there will be plenty more projects to come. Speaking of which, I think it's time I finally go edit that long overdue 1920s Qipao video, so see you next time!